From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
As a winter storm pummels the U.S. over the Christmas holiday, hundreds of thousands of Americans lose electricity. And is the green power transition to blame? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. As frigid temperatures put many states into deep freeze last week, one news story said that nearly 1.5 million customers in the United States and Canada had lost power. Let's focus to start on the PJM interconnection, which is the outfit that operates the electricity grid for 65 million people and touches 13 states, including Pennsylvania, Virginia, New Jersey, and the District of Columbia. Here's the news release. PJM is asking customers to reduce their use of electricity if health permits between the hours of 4 a.m. on December 24th and 10 a.m. on December 25th. Electricity customers can take simple conservation steps such as setting thermostats lower than usual if health permits, postponing use of major electric appliances, and turning off non-essential electric lights, equipment, and appliances. And Alicia, that wasn't even the worst of it. Duke Energy had rolling blackouts, as did the Tennessee Valley Authority. And what's notable about this story to me, I guess, is, I'm from the Midwest, so the classic winter power outage is you get wind and snow and sleet. It takes down some power lines, maybe a tree falls, and you get a localized problem. But this is not that kind of an issue. So, Alicia, what is going on here?
So there was actually multiple factors that contributed to these power shortages that spanned the country, say perhaps the West Coast where you had very nice weather. One problem was just increased demand for heating. Most people in the U.S. rely either on electricity, electric furnaces, or heat pumps for heating, or natural gas furnaces. And in places like the PJM territory, it's primarily natural gas. But during this extreme cold, people turned up their furnaces and needed more natural gas, which reduced the amount of gas that was available to the power plants in this area that heavily rely on natural gas. PJM is a territory. It has some coal nuclear plants, more so than a lot of the other areas in the country, but it also really relies on natural gas. So there's a shortage of natural gas there. Then you go down to the Carolinas and where Duke Energy operates essentially a grid or regional grid, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority. They had some power plant failures. And again, part of the problem was actually here you had a lot of demand for electricity for heating, where in the South, some 2/3 of people actually rely either on electric heat pumps or electric furnaces for heating. But these are very actually inefficient means of heating when it gets really cold or drops below freezing. They require more and more power. So here you just had a huge demand for electricity and they just didn't have that supply. And part of it, again, was because they couldn't import it from places like PJM. In the US, we have an interconnected grid. And usually when one region experiences a shortfall, they're able to get it from their neighbors. The problem is basically every region was pinched just because they didn't have enough electricity. Gas was being diverted for either heating or in some cases, when it gets really cold, the pipes freeze. That actually didn't end up being as big of a problem this time as it was during the Texas freeze in February 2021. But all this goes to underline that our grid is really becoming less and less reliable. And part of that is because of these green policies that are intended to, promote renewables that have caused a lot of the coal and nuclear baseload plants across the country to shut down, and therefore we become more reliant on natural gas to back them up, to provide baseload power and to back up the coal and nuclear plants. At the same time, our grid, there's becoming more and more strain on the grid as more appliances, heating, cooking, all of that is going electric, especially in the South, which is, again, heavily, most heating is provided through either the heat pumps or electric furnaces. And so it was just these confluence of factors that, almost took down the grid nationwide.
Just to underline a couple points there on the point about heat pumps, which have been pushed as a greener way to heat and cool a home, the Journal's editorial makes the argument that they are less efficient, especially when temperatures fall below freezing. And there's a quote from a former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission who says, quote, "With a generation fleet that is more nat gas heavy than ever before, we are using twice as much gas to heat homes through electricity as we do with gas furnaces, unquote. And it seems like there are, as Alicia said, there are several factors here. One is that natural gas in a cold snap gets diverted to home heating for understandable reasons. Another is that coal and nuclear plants are not able to easily ramp up the way that gas-fired plants are to meet these demand surges. And so, Kim, we have this confluence of these trends. And if you think about where electricity generation is going, it is always toward the phasing out of coal plants and of nuclear plants, the building of gas plants and wind turbines, which are intermittent. And so it does raise the question of at what point are we creating a huge problem of balancing the grid and meeting demand when there's a storm, a winter surge that comes through like this?
Yeah, well, this point you make about heat pumps is a great example of the policies that Alicia was mentioning that are pushed by climate activists and all the great and good in the world, telling us that we should somehow stop our reliance on natural gas. We need all of these nice electric run everything, whether it be your appliances or your heat pump, or whether or not you are charging up your electric vehicle in your garage using electricity. And that might work fine when everything is in perfect weather balance. But when you have these moments like this, and suddenly natural gas is not available to backstop the surges needed for all that additional electricity, then you have a problem. And look, the bigger bottom line is, again, if you listen to the media and you listen to the climate alarmists, they would like to tell you that the problem we are having here is worse and worse weather brought on by climate change, and this is all the more reason to double down on their policies. In reality, what we're just having is weather, okay? And America's had weather for a long time. It gets cold often and sometimes surprisingly. This is nothing new. It's not a new phenomenon. The only thing that has actually changed is our policies and our grid, which is no longer resilient, which is supposed to be the byword for the grid. That when we are concocting our policies, it's supposed to be entirely based around the notion of having a mix of energy and an ability to backstop other pieces of it so that no matter what the strain, and in moments like this where there are surprising circumstances or an unexpected storm, suddenly there is the ability for different things to kick in and work. And that's not happening at the moment because we are phasing out those coal plants and those nuclear plants, taking away one important part of that mix. We have a lot of policies like the blocking of pipelines in places like the Northeast, which means that natural gas can't get to the places it needs to get. We have more and more pressure not to use natural gas and the migration to greater electricity. We've got renewables that, that was an issue this weekend in Texas. It got really cold and the wind stopped blowing. And so they had a problem, not quite as bad as they had back in February 2021, but it's the same idea. And at a certain point, you can talk all you want, happy talk about moving green. But this is an example, what we just had yet again, of what happens when we put these policies to action with no real forethought of what it means to the undermining of grid reliance.
And the result of this is that the backstop ends up sometimes being dirtier than what you had before. So on Saturday, the U.S. Department of Energy declared a grid emergency in Texas, which allowed gas plants there, if they needed to burn oil. And Alicia, I would love to see an analysis of how much more emissions burning oil puts out for the number of days you need to stopgap through the emergency versus what you're saving by doing this green energy shift that is requiring you to burn oil for that number of days in the first place.
Right. So the backstop in most of the country, besides perhaps California, is when there's a shortage of electricity, natural gas plants end up burning oil. Some plants can actually switch to burning coal as well. These are kind of called switcher plants. And that's basically the built-in flexibility in the grid. They're not lithium-ion batteries, which can't really discharge power to the grid for more than a few hours, which isn't, when you've got a storm or, frigid temperatures that last a few days, the batteries are no good. In New England, this happens almost every winter. In this case, when they got below zero in some places, oil made up 40% of the generation. And that's partly because, as Kim was mentioning, New York has basically imposed an embargo on gas pipelines, limiting the supply to New England. And so the gas, still, this is actually New England, is heavily reliant on gas for heating. So all that comes first. And so the gas plants usually have difficulty getting enough gas, and liquefied natural gas is very difficult to get, in a pinch on the global spot market. And Kyle, you've written some randos about the Jones Act, which limits our ability to import natural gas from actually U.S. ports down on the Gulf Coast. But the result of all this is that, yes, we end up relying on oil, which is both more expensive, worse for the environment. Obviously, it's not just produces more carbon emissions, it also produces all kinds of other pollutants. Hence why the Department of Energy had to step in the case of Texas and waive some of its emissions. And these aren't the CO2 emissions standards. These are emissions limits for other kinds of pollutants that could contribute to smog and things that actually make people sick, unlike carbon dioxide. But it just shows that, all the policies that the Greens are promoting are actually, backfiring in a way, and they aren't accomplishing what they're seeking to accomplish.
Well, the natural gas blockade to New England, I would point to two things. One that Alicia was alluding to is the difficulty of transporting that by ship from export facilities in places like Texas or Louisiana to places that need natural gas like New England. Part of that is due to the Jones Act. This is this law from the 1920s that says that any waterborne cargo between any U.S. points has to be carried aboard U.S.-built ships that are crewed by Americans and owned by Americans. And last I checked, there were zero big LNG, liquid natural gas tankers that were Jones Act compliant. And so this explains why occasionally you will see a headline about a tanker of Russian natural gas coming into Boston Harbor, because that's what ends up being more economical. It also explains why Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, ends up buying a lot of its natural gas from foreign sources instead of from U.S. sources. And so, to my mind, a great America First policy would be to let Puerto Rico and let Boston buy American fracked natural gas. The other, Kim, that you were talking about is the pipeline blockade, because in order to get natural gas by pipe to New England, you have to go through New York. But here is a perfect example of where I feel like there's a lack of economic thinking on the part of the environmental movement. Because just to repeat that figure Alicia said, 40% of New England's power recently was from oil. And it seems like it would be a great environmentalist win if you could say, we're going to run a natural gas pipeline through there, and we're going to take 40% of New England's power and switch it from oil to natural gas. That would be a huge environmental win. And Kim, I just don't understand why the governors in New England can't knock down the door in Albany and get that done.
Yeah, and New York obviously is a huge problem, but let's not forget that the pipeline issue is nationwide. And this gets traced to a couple of factors. One is, in fact, the climate lobby, which routinely lodges litigation or protests different pipelines that are starting to get underway, or even when they're still in their planning stages, much less the kind of outright protests we've seen as they near completion. Let's not forget that one of the very first actions Joe Biden took upon taking office was to cancel the XL pipeline, which is a different question, but it still is symbolic of how the left views pipelines as this horrible, terrible, nasty thing. And they're correct that if you can keep them from being built, you're going to start to strangle the natural gas industry, because we need ways to get the natural gas shipped around the country. But the grid problem that we're seeing is the fallout of that successful protest movement and litigation movement that we've seen. And again, it's not just New York. We've got pipelines all over the country. So that's one problem. The other problem is getting regulatory permission from them, especially under this new administration that is purposely slowing down everything that's going on out there. And then there's the permitting and construction of them. We recently saw Congress fail yet again in this Congress to get past any permitting reform that will speed up some of these projects, which get stuck in so much bureaucracy that it can take ages to get them done. And so these are all things that governors and the federal government need to be taking into account. Again, I think the problem, though, is that we have an administration that, at the bidding of the left, remains completely hostile to any of these projects, which are going to be necessary if we want to avoid future grid moments like this.